In 2003, Debenhams was making healthy profits. Its debts were modest, manageable, the kind any respectable high street institution could carry without concern. Within 3 years, that same company was staggering under debts of well over £1 billion, not because shoppers had stopped coming, not because the business had failed, because the men who bought it had succeeded. For 2 centuries, Debenhams had survived everything Britain could throw at it. 2 world wars, the Depression, the birth of the shopping mall, the death of the shopping mall, and the birth of the internet. Queen Victoria herself had once been a customer, back when the store traded as Debenham and Freebody. Every autumn, the Christmas catalog arrived in homes across the country like a small, dependable promise. Then in the spring of 2021, after 242 years of trading, the doors closed for the very last time. And it happened in a matter of months? How does a company outlast wars and recessions and revolutions in the way people shop, only to be undone by the very people brought in to rescue it? This is the story of Debenhams, and of what happens when a business becomes worth more broken apart than kept whole. London, 1778. On Wigmore Street in the fashionable West End, a draper named William Clark opened the doors of a modest shop selling fabric, lace and gloves to the gentry and rising middle classes of Georgian London. There was no grand vision behind it, no proclaimed ambition to build an empire. It was, in the way of most drapers' shops of the period, a trade built on cloth, credit, and reputation, on knowing which silks would please a customer and which would not, on remembering names and preferences, on the quiet, unglamorous work of running an honest shop well. Clark could not have known that the business would still exist in some form nearly 250 years later. He could not have known it would eventually carry a different name entirely. That name arrived in 1813 when a young man called William Debenham became a partner in the firm. The business was renamed Clark and Debenham, and though Clark himself would fade from the story in the decades that followed, the Debenham name did not. It proved sturdy enough to survive one partnership after another. In 1851, Clement Freebody joined, and the shop became Debenham and Freebody, a name grand enough to suit its growing reputation among London's fashionable set. In 1876, when Freebody retired, George Hewitt stepped in, and the business traded for a time as Debenham and Hewitt. This was not, in other words, the story of one visionary founder building a monument to his own name. It was something quieter and, in its way, more remarkable. A business passed carefully from partner to partner, each one adding something, none of them tearing down what came before. Trust rather than spectacle was what the shop was built on. Trust that a customer walking in on a Tuesday afternoon would find the same quality of fabric, the same fair dealing, the same recognition at the counter that they had found the week before. The original shop at 44 Wigmore Street would have felt intimate by later standards. A single storefront, walls lined with bolts of silk and cotton, drawers of lace and ribbon, the particular hush of a shop dealing in fine things. The customers were the gentry and the comfortable middle classes of Georgian and later Regency London. Women shopping for gloves and bonnets, families outfitting themselves for the season, all conducted with the unhurried formality of the era. To walk into Clark's shop, and later into Clark and Debenham, was to enter a world where a shop assistant might know a customer's preferences before she stated them, where credit was extended on the strength of a name and a reputation rather than a piece of paper. By 1818, the business had grown confident enough to open a second store in the fashionable spa town of Cheltenham, a signal that this was no longer simply a London concern, but the beginning of something that would, in time, spread its name across the whole of Britain. What nobody in that small Wigmore Street shop could have imagined was how far the name would eventually travel, or how, more than 2 centuries later, the very success they were quietly building would become the thing that made their creation a target. By the 1970s, Debenhams was not simply a shop people visited. It was a fixture of British life, woven so thoroughly into the rhythm of the year that most customers never stopped to think about it, which was, in its own way, the truest measure of its success. A high street without a Debenhams felt somehow incomplete, the way a Sunday without a roast dinner felt incomplete. It was simply there, the way the seasons were there. For a certain generation, The arrival of the Christmas catalog each autumn was an event in its own right. It landed on doormats and dining tables across the country with the weight and promise of something far grander than its glossy pages suggested. Children pored over the toy sections for weeks before December, circling the items they hoped might appear under the tree, while parents used it to plan, to save, to imagine. It was not simply a way of ordering goods. It was a document of hope, delivered once a year, proof that abundance existed and that, with patience, some of it might arrive at your own front door. Inside the stores themselves, Debenhams had built something equally distinctive, a genuine sense of occasion around the ordinary act of shopping. The launch of Designers at Debenhams in the 1990s, bringing names like Jasper Conran, John Rocha, and later Ted Baker into the heart of the high street, meant that a family on a modest budget could bring home clothing with real design pedigree, not merely passable imitations of it. For many customers, walking past the Jasper Conran rail felt like brushing up against a world of fashion that had until then seemed to belong only to London's grander department stores and glossier magazines. The stores themselves were built for lingering. Many carried in-store restaurants and cafes, where a mother might sit down with a pot of tea and a slice of cake after an hour spent among the clothing racks, her shopping bags gathered around her chair, in no particular hurry to leave. There were beauty counters staffed by women who remembered which foundation shade a regular customer wore and which perfume her husband preferred to buy her at Christmas. There were toy departments in the run-up to December, filled with the particular electric excitement that only a child pressed against a glass counter can produce. At the center of it all stood the flagship store on Oxford Street, a building so large, so central to London's identity as a shopping destination, that for many visitors to the capital, a trip to Debenhams' Oxford Street store was as much a part of the London experience as a walk through Hyde Park or a photograph outside Buckingham Palace. It was less a shop than a landmark, one that towns and cities across Britain sought, in their own smaller way, to echo with their own local Debenhams branch. For the people who worked behind the counters, the store was more than a job. Many staff spent decades in the same department, in the same store, watching customers grow from teenagers buying their first proper coat into mothers bringing in children of their own. There was pride in that continuity, pride in being the person who remembered a customer's collar size, who could find exactly the right shade of lipstick without needing to be told twice, who took genuine satisfaction in a well-organized shop floor at the end of a long Saturday. What was it exactly that made a Saturday morning at Debenhams feel less like an errand and more like a small event worth dressing for? Perhaps it was the sense of occasion built into the architecture and the ritual alike. The escalators rising past floor after floor of neatly arranged apartments, the perfume counters releasing their mingled scents into the air near the entrance, the particular hum of a store full of people who had chosen, quite deliberately, to spend their free time there. Perhaps it was simply that Debenhams asked nothing of its customers beyond their presence. No membership, no exclusivity, no sense that some other kind of customer was more welcome than they were. It was, in the truest sense, a store built for everyone, for the family stretching a weekly budget as far as it would go, and for the customer treating herself to something from the designer rail. By the turn of the millennium, Debenhams stood among the most recognizable names on the British high street, profitable, well-regarded, seemingly secure. Its balance sheet was healthy, its stores were full. Nothing about the company, on paper or on the shop floor, suggested that anything was about to go wrong, which was, as it would turn out, precisely the problem. A company this stable, this profitable, this laden with valuable freehold property, was not a company at risk of collapse from the outside. It was a company that had just become very attractive to people who did not intend to run it for the next 200 years, but for the next two. By the early 20th century, Debenhams had begun to transform from a single respected London store into something far larger, a national network built through acquisition rather than organic growth alone. Under the leadership of Ernest Debenham, who took the company public and served as its chairman, the business embarked on a sustained campaign of buying up well-established department stores in towns and cities across Britain. Marshall and Snellgrove, the fashionable Oxford Street rival, was absorbed into the group. Harvey Nichols, the Knightsbridge institution, came under Debenhams' control in 1920, Through the 1920s, the Drapery Trust, a holding company assembled specifically to acquire regional department stores, brought names like Bobby & Co., Bon Marché, and Swan and Edgar into the fold. This was expansion of a particular kind. Not the building of new stores from scratch, but the steady accumulation of Britain's most trusted local retail names, one respected regional institution at a time. Each acquired store typically kept its own name, its own local identity, its own loyal customer base who had shopped there for generations and had no particular reason to think of themselves as part of some larger London-based group. A shopper in Harrogate or Cheltenham might walk into what was, by then, technically a Debenhams' own store and see no sign whatsoever that anything had changed. The counter staff were the same. The layout was the same. The name above the door, in many cases, remained exactly what it had always been. It would not be until 1977 that this patchwork of acquired regional stores was formally unified under a single banner, with the great majority rebranded collectively as Debenhams. Overnight, or as close to overnight as a rebranding exercise spanning dozens of towns could manage, decades of distinct local retail history were folded into one national identity. For customers, the change was largely cosmetic. The same buildings, the same staff, a new name on the signage. But administratively, it marked something more significant. Debenhams had gone from being a single London store with a handful of satellite branches to being a genuinely national department store chain, its stores stitched together from dozens of once independent businesses that had never been designed to operate as a single, integrated whole. This method of growth brought real advantages. It gave Debenhams instant scale, instant geographic reach, and instant access to customer loyalty that had already been built up over decades by the stores it acquired. Loyalty that would have taken a lifetime to earn from scratch in each new town. Britain, almost overnight in retail terms, gained a single department store brand with a presence from the south coast to the Scottish borders. But it also planted a structural weakness that would take decades to fully reveal itself. Because so many of these stores had been acquired rather than built, each one continued for years to operate with a surprising degree of independence. Separate stock ordering, separate local management practices, separate relationships with suppliers, separate ways of doing the same basic job. What looked from the outside like a single unified department store chain was in practice something closer to a loose federation of formerly independent shops, each one still carrying habits and systems inherited from its pre-Debenhams days. Achieving genuine efficiency, the kind of centralized buying power and streamlined operations that a chain of this size ought to have commanded, would prove to be a slow and difficult undertaking, one that lingered as an unresolved problem well into the decades that followed. For the employees caught up in this transformation, the expansion meant something more personal than balance sheets and rebranding exercises. A shop assistant who had spent 15 years working for Marshall and Snellgrove now found herself, without ever changing employers in any meaningful sense, working for Debenhams instead. Her pension, her seniority, her working life folded into a company whose name she had not chosen and whose headquarters she had likely never visited. For some, this brought genuine opportunity. A larger company meant more paths for advancement, more stores to transfer between, a bigger stage. For others, it meant a quiet loss of the intimate, locally rooted identity that had defined their working lives. The sense of working for a store the whole town knew and trusted by its own name, rather than for a distant national group. By the time this era of acquisition drew to a close, Debenhams had become exactly what its ambitious expansion had set out to build. One of the largest and most recognizable department store groups in Britain, its name displayed above shop fronts in nearly every major town in the country. It had also, in the process of getting there, listed itself on the London Stock Exchange, becoming a public company whose shares could be bought, sold, and eventually fought over by investors with very different ideas about what the business ought to become. By the closing decades of the 20th century, Debenhams had achieved something that few retailers manage in a single lifetime, let alone across 2 centuries. It had become not merely a shop people used, but a shop people belonged to, with around 178 stores spread across the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Denmark, where it owned the respected Magasin du Nord chain, and franchise outlets reaching into 19 countries beyond, Debenhams had achieved a kind of quiet ubiquity. There were larger retailers by some measures and grander ones by others, but few could claim to be, in the truest sense, Britain's store, present in nearly every town large enough to support a department store, familiar to nearly every family in the country. That familiarity was built, year upon year, on rituals that had become fixed points on the domestic calendar. The Christmas catalog was chief among them. Its arrival each autumn was not treated as junk mail to be discarded, but as a document worth keeping on the coffee table, worth returning to again and again in the weeks before December. For children, it was a wish list made tangible. The toy department transported directly into the living room, pages bent back and corners folded down around whatever had caught a young eye that year. For parents, particularly those managing tight budgets, it was a planning tool, a way of laying out months in advance exactly what could be afforded and what would have to wait. In households across Britain, the catalog was passed from hand to hand at the kitchen table, and in that small domestic ritual lay something larger, evidence that Debenhams had made itself part of the private, internal life of British families, not merely the site of their occasional errands. That kind of loyalty rarely stayed contained within a single generation. It was common and unremarkable for a woman to recall being taken to the Debenhams toy department by her own mother as a child, only to find herself, decades later, walking those same aisles with her own children in tow, and later still, her grandchildren. The store's flagship branches, Oxford Street above all, but also the grand civic anchor stores in cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds, became landmarks around which entire afternoons were organized. A lunch beforehand, an hour or two moving through the departments, a stop at the in-store cafe, a walk home with bags swinging from tired arms. These were not merely shopping trips. They were the small, recurring occasions out of which ordinary family life is built. For the tens of thousands of people employed across the Debenhams network at its height, working for the company carried its own quiet form of pride. To be a Debenhams employee was to be part of something recognizably national, and yet the work itself remained deeply local, serving the same community, in many cases, for an entire career. Store managers spoke of their branches not as outposts of a distant corporate entity, but as the flagship building of their own town, a source of civic identity as much as commercial activity. Staff loyalty schemes, long service awards, and the simple accumulated familiarity of decades behind the same counter gave the workforce a sense of permanence that few retail employers, before or since, have managed to offer. How many places in modern Britain could claim that 3 generations of the same family had, without any particular occasion or ceremony, walked through the same doors together? By any reasonable measure, footprint, brand recognition, financial performance, the sheer depth of its place in British domestic life. Debenhams entering the 21st century looked less like a company facing difficulty than a company that had, in some fundamental sense, already won. Its balance sheet was healthy. Its debts were modest and entirely manageable. Its stores were full, its reputation intact, its position on the high street seemingly unassailable. It was precisely this, the health, the stability, the sheer scale of unlocked value sitting quietly on its books in the form of freehold city center property, that would soon make Debenhams one of the most closely studied targets in British retail. Not because anything was wrong with the company, but because to a particular kind of investor beginning to circle the London Stock Exchange in the early 2000s, a company this healthy, carrying this little debt, owning this much valuable real estate outright, represented not security, it represented opportunity. In 2003, a consortium of private equity investors, CVC Capital Partners, Texas Pacific Group, and Merrill Lynch Private Equity, working alongside Debenhams' own chief executive, Rob Templeman, agreed to take the company private in a deal valued at somewhere between $1.7 and $1.8 billion. On paper, it read as a straightforward transaction. A group of experienced investors backing a proven management team, buying a healthy and well-regarded retailer in order to help it grow further outside the glare of public markets. What made the deal remarkable was not its size, but its structure. The consortium put up only around $600 million of their own money. The remaining balance, well over £1 billion, was financed through debt. Crucially, this was not debt the investors themselves would carry. It was debt loaded directly onto Debenhams itself to be repaid out of the company's own future earnings. The retailer that only months earlier had carried a modest and entirely manageable debt of around $128 million now found itself, on paper, responsible for financing the very transaction that had just changed its ownership. This was not an unusual arrangement in the world of private equity. It had a name, well understood in the financial circles: the leveraged buyout. A target company is acquired using borrowed money, and that borrowed money becomes the target company's own obligation to repay. The investor's risk is limited to the relatively modest sum they contributed themselves. The company being bought carries nearly all of the financial weight. If the strategy works and the business grows enough to comfortably service its new debt, everybody involved profits. If it does not, the company that was healthy on the day of the purchase can find itself struggling under a burden it never chose to take on. For the people working the shop floors of Debenhams in 2003 and the years that followed, almost none of this was visible. Store managers continued reporting healthy weekly takings. Sales assistants continued serving the same loyal customers who had shopped there for decades, entirely unaware that somewhere in the offices of the company's new owners, financial structures were being arranged that would determine the fate of the buildings they stood in. A department manager in Leeds or Cardiff, closing out another solid Saturday's trading, had no reason to suspect that the store's ownership had just been reorganized in a way that placed enormous new financial obligations directly onto the business she worked for. This was, in its own way, the beginning of a very particular kind of dramatic irony, one that would come to define the rest of Debenham's story. The customers browsing the coat racks, the staff restocking the beauty counters, the families gathering for the annual Christmas shop, carried on entirely as before. Nothing about their daily experience of the store had changed, and yet at the very moment they were experiencing Debenhams as reassuringly permanent, unshakable, exactly as it had always been, the financial foundation beneath their feet had just shifted in ways that would not become visible on the shop floor for years. How does a company that was, by every conventional measure, financially healthy, profitable, low on debt, full of loyal customers, end up, within a matter of months, transformed into one of the most heavily indebted retailers in Britain? The answer lay not in anything Debenhams had done wrong, but in what made it so attractive in the first place: its very stability. A company this reliable, this well-regarded, carrying this little existing debt, was precisely the kind of business capable of absorbing a very large new debt load without immediately collapsing under the strain, at least not straight away. It was healthy enough to be worth borrowing against, and that, in the world the consortium operated in, was worth more than being simply healthy on its own terms. What the shoppers filling their baskets that Christmas could not have known was that the very qualities that made Debenhams feel so dependable, the 2 centuries of continuous trading, the loyal customer base, the valuable buildings it owned outright in city centers across the country, were the same qualities that had just made it a target. The transaction had been completed, the debt had been placed, and the clock, though nobody in any of the stores could hear it yet, had already started running. Once the 2003 buyout was complete, the new owners moved quickly to extract value from the one asset Debenhams held that no amount of clever retailing could easily replicate: the buildings themselves. Across Britain, Debenhams owned outright dozens of the very stores it traded from. City center flagships on prime high street land, built up over generations, unencumbered by any mortgage or lease. To a private equity consortium looking to recoup its investment as quickly as possible, this freehold property represented a vast pool of capital sitting largely idle, tied up in bricks and mortar, rather than working for its new owners. The solution was a strategy known as sale and leaseback. Debenhams sold off a substantial portion of its store properties, the very ground beneath its own flagship branches, to property investors in exchange for immediate cash. In return, the company agreed to lease back those same buildings, now paying rent year after year, simply to continue trading from premises it had, until recently, owned outright and free of any such obligation. The logic, from the investor's perspective, was straightforward. Cash from the property sales could be extracted swiftly, distributed to the consortium as a return on their initial investment, while the underlying retail business carried on essentially unchanged from a customer's point of view. Shoppers walking into the Oxford Street flagship or the Grand Debenhams branch in Manchester noticed no difference whatsoever. The escalators still ran. The beauty counters were still staffed. The Christmas catalog still arrived on schedule each autumn. But the company that had only recently owned its most valuable properties outright now owed rent on nearly all of them. A permanent, recurring cost that had not existed before the buyout, layered directly on top of the debt already taken on to finance the purchase itself. By 2006, with the sale and leaseback program largely complete and a substantial dividend already extracted, the consortium returned Debenhams to the London Stock Exchange through a fresh public flotation. For CVC, Texas Pacific Group, and Merrill Lynch, the float allowed much of their original investment to be recovered, alongside a considerable profit. Reports at the time suggested the three firms had collectively realized returns running into the hundreds of millions of pounds on an initial outlay of roughly $600 million, achieved in barely 3 years. For the new shareholders buying into Debenhams on the stock market in 2006, however, they were purchasing a very different company from the one that had existed before 2003, one now carrying debt of roughly $1.2 billion, alongside a long list of annual rent obligations on buildings it no longer owned. For the people running the shop floor day to day, the consequences of this arrangement did not arrive as a single dramatic announcement. They arrived slowly in the form of decisions that, taken individually, seemed minor, even reasonable, but which, added together over years, told a clear story. Store refurbishment budgets, once routine, became harder to secure. A worn carpet in the shoe department went unreplaced for another year, then another. Lighting fixtures that had flickered for months were patched rather than renewed. Escalators ran a little slower to service, repairs a little further delayed. None of it was dramatic enough, on its own, to alarm a regular customer. But staff who had worked in the same store for 15 or 20 years noticed the change precisely because they had a memory to compare it against, a sense of what the store used to look like before money for its upkeep became, quietly and permanently, harder to come by. Some of those staff understood in broad terms why this was happening. Trade publications and financial journalists had, by the mid-2000s, begun to take a critical interest in the private equity playbook Debenhams had just lived through. The debt, the property sales, the rapid extraction of value ahead of a stock market listing. But for most people working behind the counters, the connection between distant financial engineering and the tired carpet beneath their feet was never made explicit. They simply watched a company that had always taken evident pride in the condition of its stores become, gradually, a little less able to maintain that pride, and had no clear answer for why, beyond a general sense that money somehow had become tighter than it used to be. The truth, largely invisible from the shop floor, was that very little of the consortium's return had come from making Debenhams a better retailer. It had come from restructuring how the company was financed and who owned the ground it stood on. The stores were, in the years that followed, expected to generate enough profit not only to serve their existing operations, but to cover rent payments on buildings the company itself had recently owned outright, a cost that had not existed for the previous 200 years of the company's history, and one that would now persist for as long as those leases ran. Who exactly was supposed to answer for a company being loaded with debt and rent obligations it had never needed and had not asked for, while the people who arranged it walked away with their profits already banked? By the time Debenhams' new public shareholders began asking harder questions about the company's debt and its dwindling capacity to invest in its own estate, The consortium that had engineered the situation was largely gone from the register, its returns long since realized. What remained was a 200-year-old retailer, its buildings no longer its own, its balance sheet weighed down by obligations built for the benefit of its former owners rather than its future, and a slow, steady decline in the physical condition of stores that had once been a source of genuine local pride, now beginning almost imperceptibly to show its age. The first public sign that something was seriously wrong came in April 2019. Debenhams entered administration, a formal insolvency process, through what is known as a pre-pack arrangement, engineered by the company's lenders. In a single stroke, existing shareholders were wiped out entirely, their stock reduced to nothing. Among those shareholders was Sports Direct, the discount retail group controlled by Mike Ashley, which had built up a stake of close to 30% in Debenhams and had in the months beforehand made rescue offers that the company and its creditors ultimately rejected. The retailer that had once been healthy enough to attract a leveraged buyout worth close to £2 billion was now insolvent in all but name, kept alive only through the intervention of the very lenders it owed money to. For a company that had survived 2 centuries of British history without ever facing formal insolvency, this was a watershed moment, though for many ordinary shoppers, it barely registered. The stores stayed open. The Christmas catalog, in its final surviving years, still arrived. But for the roughly 25,000 people employed across the Debenhams network, the language of administration, restructuring, and creditor negotiations became an unwelcome new part of daily working life, layered on top of jobs that had, until recently, felt entirely secure. Then came the pandemic. In April 2020, as national lockdowns closed shops across Britain, Debenhams entered administration for a second time in barely a year, this time with COVID-19 cited as the immediate cause, though the underlying vulnerability had been built more than 15 years earlier. Stores closed under lockdown restrictions, reopened briefly as rules eased, then faced renewed uncertainty as the pandemic dragged on. For staff already unsettled by one round of administration, a second insolvency within 12 months, arriving alongside a national health crisis, brought a very different kind of dread. Not the abstract anxiety of financial restructuring happening somewhere in a boardroom, but the immediate personal fear of a livelihood disappearing entirely at the worst possible moment to be searching for another one. By December 2020, with the company still trading, but its position increasingly precarious, Debenhams announced it would begin liquidation, the formal winding down of the business, rather than any further attempt at rescue or restructuring. In January 2021, Boohoo, the online fashion retailer, agreed to purchase the Debenhams brand name and its website operations for $55 million. It was a deal that preserved the name Debenhams and the possibility of shopping under that name online, but it did not preserve a single physical shop. The 124 stores still trading across the United Kingdom at that point were not part of the sale. They were instead scheduled for permanent closure. The closure notice, when it came, was unusually direct in acknowledging what was being lost. Announcing the final wind down of its remaining stores, Debenhams told the public, over the next 10 days it would close its doors on the high street for the final time in its 242-year history, and it hoped customers would visit one last time before the final goodbye. For staff, the closure arrived not as a single national event, but as a series of local ones, store by store, town by town, through the early months of 2021. In each branch, employees who had spent years, in many cases decades, behind the same counters were handed notice that their store would not reopen. Some had joined as teenagers and were now in their 50s, their entire working lives bound up with a single shop floor, a single set of regular customers, a single town's high street. They were losing more than employment. They were losing a place that had, in a very real sense, structured their working identity for years. For customers, the final weeks brought a particular melancholy kind of shopping trip. Regulars who had visited the same store for a decade or more came in not to buy anything in particular, but simply to walk through it one more time. To see the beauty counters, the escalators, the cafe tables, before they vanished for good. Shelves that had once been carefully arranged grew steadily emptier as stock was sold off and not replenished. Liquidation signage appeared in windows that had, for generations, displayed nothing more urgent than the next season's fashion. Long-serving staff, some of whom had outlasted multiple changes of ownership, multiple rounds of administration, and a global pandemic, found themselves saying goodbye to customers they had served for years, often with neither side entirely sure what to say. National newspapers and broadcasters covered the closures with a tone closer to bereavement than business reporting. Commentators and members of the public alike marking the end of an institution that had, for many, been simply assumed to be permanent. Social media filled in those final weeks with photographs of empty flagship stores and personal recollections of Christmas shopping trips and Saturday outings stretching back decades. On 15th of May 2021, the last Debenhams stores in Britain closed their doors for good. 242 years after William Clark first opened a small drapery shop on Wigmore Street, the name Debenhams disappeared from the British High Street entirely. Not through any failure to serve its customers, but through a chain of financial decisions set in motion nearly 2 decades earlier by people who had long since moved on with their profits secured. What remained was not a story of a retailer that had lost its way, or failed to understand its customers, or misjudged the market it served. It was the story of a company that had done almost everything right for 200 years, and had still not been able to survive what was done to it in the space of a few. When the last Debenhams stores closed in May 2021, the gaps they left did not stay empty for long, but rarely were they filled by anything resembling what had been there before. In town after town, the flagship building that had anchored the local high street for generations now stood dark, its windows papered over, its escalators silent. Shopping centers and high streets that had been built, quite literally in some cases, around a Debenhams store as their principal anchor tenant, found themselves facing a familiar and painful pattern. Once the anchor left, the smaller shops around it, the ones that had relied on Debenhams to draw footfall through the door, began to struggle in turn. In more than a few towns, the departure of Debenhams did not simply remove one large shop. It triggered a slow unraveling of the surrounding retail district, as smaller retailers who had depended on that shared footfall found their own trade quietly draining away. Some of the vacated buildings found new purpose. A handful of the grandest flagship stores, architecturally significant enough to attract developers, were converted into flats, offices, or mixed-use retail and leisure space. Their original department store character preserved only in the shell of the building itself. Others fared less well, left vacant for years, subject to planning disputes, slowly deteriorating in the way that empty commercial buildings tend to, becoming, in the language of local newspapers, an eyesore at the heart of a town center that had once been proud to have them there. The Debenhams name did not vanish entirely. Under its new owner, Boohoo, it was relaunched in April 2021 as a purely online retailer, selling clothing and homeware under the old familiar name, but through a business model that bore almost no resemblance to what Debenhams had once been. There were no shop floors, no beauty counters staffed by familiar faces, no Christmas catalog landing on doormats each autumn. The name had survived. The institution it once described had not. In the years since, the online business has continued in a much smaller form, at one point reportedly turning to artificial intelligence for product photography in place of the photographers and stylists who might once have staffed such work in-house. A small, telling coda to a story about what happens when a business built on human relationships is stripped down to its most efficient, least personal parts. For the wider retail industry, Debenhams' collapse became something closer to a case study than a cautionary anecdote. One frequently cited alongside other British retailers, such as BHS and House of Fraser, that had followed a strikingly similar arc. Decades of stability, a private equity buyout laden with debt, a sale and leaseback stripped of its most valuable property assets, and a collapse that arrived years, sometimes decades, after the transaction that had actually caused it. Financial journalists and industry analysts increasingly pointed to this pattern as a structural risk peculiar to older, asset-rich retailers, companies whose very stability and property wealth made them, paradoxically, more vulnerable to this particular kind of financial engineering than newer, leaner competitors with nothing valuable to extract. For the roughly 25,000 people who had worked for Debenhams at the time of its final closure, the aftermath took many different forms. Some, particularly younger staff, found new positions relatively quickly in a retail sector still recovering from the pandemic. Others, especially those who had spent 20 or 30 years in a single store, in a single department, accumulating seniority and expertise specific to a company that no longer existed, found the transition considerably harder, their skills and long service counting for less than they once might have hoped in a job market that had moved on without them. Pension arrangements and redundancy terms varied by circumstance, but for many long-serving employees, the closure marked not simply the loss of a job, but the loss of an entire working identity built up over decades. The towns that lost their Debenhams were left, in the years that followed, to answer a harder question than any balance sheet could resolve. When the anchor store at the heart of a high street disappears, and nothing quite fills the space it leaves behind, not commercially and not in the life of the town itself, what exactly does a community lose, and how much of it can ever really be replaced? Somewhere in Britain tonight, someone is describing Debenhams to a person too young to have known it, trying to find the words for something that was never really about the merchandise at all. The smell of the ground floor, perfume and new fabric mingling together near the entrance, the particular hush of the beauty hall on a quiet weekday morning, the weight of a shopping bag with the right name printed on the side, carried out through doors that had stood on the same high street for longer than anyone's grandparents could remember. The Christmas catalog arriving each autumn, dog-eared and creased from being read a dozen times before December ever came. The person listening will not fully understand. They were not there for the Saturday mornings that had no particular purpose beyond simply being spent inside those walls. They never watched a shop assistant recognize a regular customer by sight and reach without being asked for the shade of lipstick she always bought. They never felt the specific, modest thrill of the toy department in the weeks before Christmas, nose pressed close to glass counters, a whole year's worth of wanting compressed into a single hour. But they will understand something else, from the way it is described, from the care taken over details that seem, on the surface, almost too small to mention. They will understand that something real was here. For 242 years, Debenhams was never simply a place to buy things. It was where 3 generations of the same family might, without any occasion or ceremony, walk through the same doors together. A grandmother, a mother, a daughter, each carrying her own memory of the same escalators, the same counters, the same particular light falling through the same high windows. It was the flagship building that gave a town's high street its center of gravity, the destination around which a whole Saturday might be organized, the place that made an ordinary errand feel, if only briefly, like something worth putting on a good coat for. It survived 2 world wars, a depression, and the birth of nearly every retail format that eventually tried to replace it. What it could not survive was a single decision, made in 2003, by people who saw in its stability not a reason for confidence, but an opportunity to be extracted. It would be easy and understandable to tell this story with anger at the investors who took hundreds of millions of pounds in profit, while the company that made it possible for them was left carrying debts it never needed and rent on buildings it once owned outright. At the years of quietly deferred repairs that let once immaculate stores grow tired at the edges, at a pandemic that delivered the final blow to a business that had already been weakened, unknowingly, for the better part of 2 decades before anyone could see it happening. But anger was never what these stores were built to hold. They were built to hold ordinary family life, unremarkable, repeated, and precious precisely because it was shared, week after week, year after year, without anyone ever pausing to call it precious at the time. So let this be a farewell instead, offered with the same quiet dignity Debenhams once offered its customers. To the shop assistants who learned 1,000 regular faces by name and never once made a customer feel like a stranger. To the store managers who took genuine pride in a town's flagship building long after the money for its upkeep had grown scarce. To William Clark, who opened a small drapery shop on Wigmore Street in 1778 with no thought of empire, only of doing an honest trade well. And to every family who ever walked out through those doors carrying a bag with the Debenhams name on the side, certain, without ever quite saying so, that they had just been somewhere that mattered. The shops are gone now. The debt that took them, the buildings that were sold from beneath them, the decisions made in boardrooms far from any shop floor, all of it is finished, its consequences long since settled. But the memory carried carefully from one generation to the next in exactly the way it always was does not have to be.